This is a light trench mortar. The Germans call it a Minenwerfer. 50% of the casualties in World War I were caused by artillery, and a good number of those were caused by machines like this. And infantrymen on both sides hated them. I hadn't realized until just a few years ago that these things were actually captured from Germany and Austria in World War I and taken here as trophies, not as mementos like the tank out front, not as mementos of our own, armed forces, but as war trophies. And that's part of the thinking as well, I think. That had always been how an army would measure the extent of its victory. How many guns did you capture? And take the guns home and put them in your town square, or melt them down if they're bronze and turn them into bells. He was a colonel in the army as well. He was sent to Europe to make an inventory of captured ordnance, and being an archivist with a tidy mind, came up with a very detailed report on how this booty should be allocated by province, by community, because even in 1917, Ottawa was starting to get requests from communities that had heard that our battalion has captured a gun, and we'd like to have that after the war. So Ottawa assumed that there would be quite a flood of requests. A city, I think it was a city over 50,000 people, would be eligible for one of the large, 6-inch howitzers or 77mm field guns. Prince Edward Island, I think we were entitled to get 8 field guns, or 8 large artillery pieces, even though we didn't have a single city over 50,000, but we were allocated, I think, with 8 artillery pieces and a couple of dozen, trench mortars, and about 30 or 40 Maxim guns, and they were allocated out from cities like Charlottetown to little villages like Mount Stewart. I suspect that the federal government paid to get them there, and there was also a bit of a codicil to it that the community's got to look after this or we'll take them back, because you'll then see letters to the editor in the early 1920s about, we have a trench mortar, it's out in front of this library and no one's looking after it. That's a shocking shame to be disrespecting the memory of our fallen like that. And this trench mortar was allocated to Mount Stewart, just up the river here from Charlottetown, and for the better part of 85 years it stood in front of a little war memorial in the People's Cemetery in Mount Stewart. And it was in the last 5 years or so that the museum here took it in, did some repairs, and asked if they could keep it on display out of the weather. This is the village of Mount Stewart. And in 1920, Mount Stewart was eligible to get a field piece, a field gun, and a trench mortar. It's a 77mm field piece, and there is a very eloquent hole in the shield, in the defensive shield there, where I expect the gun met its end at one point. At the time, this was going to be the war that ends war. So these were seen at the time, I think, that every community is going to want to have a piece of this now forgotten history, because we're never going to have a war like this again, right? So everyone's going to want a trophy from the last war that we won, and that these would be the war memorials. The communities obviously had a different take on it, because even as these things are being allocated to go to libraries and town halls and such, communities are raising funds to put up the kind of war memorials that we now consider the war memorial: the cenotaphs, the statue, the bronze statue, the marble ones that are the focal point of every Remembrance Day ceremony. But that, I don't think, was in the thinking in Ottawa when they were collecting these war trophies and allocating them out. As a museum person, I think it's amazing that as many of them still survive as do, because a large artillery piece, that's going to survive a lot of weather. But something like that, even a trench mortar out in the weather for 85 years, is going to start to get pretty fragile. Most of this stuff got recycled in World War II as scrap metal, when in this kind of like a delicious irony, at least seen at the time, ordnance that was captured from Germany in World War I was scooped up by scrap metal drives and then turned into munitions to fire back at Germany in World War II. And that's where most of these World War I war trophy monuments ended up, in scrap drives in World War II.